I'm Al Filreis, and this is PoemTalk at the Writer's House, where I have the pleasure of convening three friends in the world of contemporary poetry and poetics to collaborate on a close but not too close reading of a poem. We'll talk, maybe even disagree a bit, and perhaps open up the verse to a few new possibilities, and we hope gain for a poem that interests us some new readers and listeners. And I say listeners because all PoemTalk poems are available in recordings made by the poets themselves as part of our Pen Sound archive. writing.upenn.edu/pensound. Today I'm joined here in Philadelphia in the Arts Cafe of the Kelly Writers House by Jessica Lowenthal, a teacher and poet, author of As If Interning, and director of the Kelly Writers House. And by Rachel Blau DuPlessis, poet, teacher, critic, editor, whose new book of poems is Torque's Drafts 58 to 76. And by Charles Bernstein, whose most recent book of poems is Girly Man, whose great Pen Sound page I happily recommend, and who indeed, with me, is the co-founder and co-director of the Pen Sound Project. Welcome back, Rachel and Jessica, and hello, Charles, and welcome to PoemTalk. Our poem today is one of William Blake's songs of experience, The Garden of Love, as sung by Allen Ginsberg. It was recorded, along with many other Blake songs, in New York on December 15th, 1969. Well, gang, am I wrong? Did the first I get pronounced ah? Ah went to the Garden of Love as if it were a Southern accent. Did anybody hear that?
Well, he's trying to have a country sound.
So it really is. This ballad fits. This is a country sound.
Well, and within the context of the singing overall on the record, it's the only one that's like that.
It's the only one that's
the
like
other ones
that.
are more chant-like, actually.
Rachel, did it sound good to you, the voice?
I'll tell you something. I was intrigued by this because I was more used to the fact that he does a lot of chanting and things that are a little more religious on a lot of the recordings. I loved that it was a waltz, which goes with the rhythm of the poem, and I loved that it was dirtied, that the sound was raggedy. And if you listen to the others, also, is it like the voices are untrained? They're kind of awkward. The entrances and harmonies are not that finished, but I liked it.
I think in this record, which made a very deep impression on me in college, I played it hundreds of times.
Why?
I thought that Ginsberg really was creating a connection between the illuminated manuscripts of the Songs of Innocent Experience and the alphabetic poem, the text that we read, and the idea that they were also sung, to bring it into a kind of fourth dimensional reality. Begins, hear the voice of the bard,
right,
who present, past, and future sees. And that's the more kind of prophetic Ginsberg. And I think here he wanted to have something more amusing and satiric as a counterpoint to the other, especially the other songs of experience, which are very dark.
And I saw it was filled with graves and tombstones where flowers should be, and priests in black gowns were walking their rounds.
Jessica, I think that you find this to be ironic given the content of the poem he chose. Can you explain that irony?
Yeah, I guess I was surprised. I also listened to a few of the other poems, although I wasn't as familiar with the record.
You didn't play it again and again in college?
No, I didn't.
Right.
But the others...
Charles, you need to have gotten a life. Wasn't anything more happening at Harvard than...
It wasn't available when she was probably in college.
But now it is
But
again.
now it is.
I
saw to that.
So
I guess
what about this
the
irony?
other pieces were so dark and atonal. The sick rose in particular.
Oh,
kind
Rose, thou art sick.
Exactly, it
the
matches.
Invisible world.
It matches just like that. It is sickening in a way.
What do you think? Do you buy the idea that the tune is sort of deliberately inappropriate to the theme?
I don't see inappropriate. I mean, I think one thing that he's doing in the record or the set is to try to channel some dimension of Blake and Blake's singing and the idea of the poet singing and the poet's song. I think that there's a lot of ways in which Blake is always incommensurable in different aspects of what he's saying. That's what makes you go back to it. It's different to being ambiguous or ironic. There are often multiple and discrepant ways of understanding aspects of what's going on. So one way I would think about what you're saying is that if you understand the relation of the tune to the poem, to the content, as just not one adding to the other, but actually being different and in conflict, that's a Blakean mode, that the tune should be in conflict. It should create a challenge to the content.
And the gates of this chapel were shut, and thou shalt not rid over the door.
I think that there's this binary that Blake is working with all the time, as we know, songs of innocence and experience. And
this
that
is, to be sure, a song of experience.
This is to be sure. And this binary is broken by the music, where the innocence is still trumping the experience. But here, what he's saying, the message is that there's binding. And when that message comes at the end, in the last two lines, what you have is a 4-beat line instead of a 3-beat line. Everything else is 3-beat lines.
Internal to the line.
There's rhymes internal to the line, which speeds up the line, shortens it, and cuts it off, changing the scheme. Literally, it makes a tight leash at the end. And priests in black gowns were walking their rounds and binding with briars my joys and desires.
You know, the problem is it's Ginsberg's identifying with Blake's inability to grow up and face that reality is not just the Garden of Eden, and then using this, really scurrilous attack on religion as a way to bolster this adolescent
Ginsberg is doing the bolstering?
Well, Ginsberg adopting Blake to make this point really against civilization and against order.
Right, and institutions.
And institutions.
I just love the way Ginsberg's singing the speaker, I, suddenly becomes Ginsberg. I mean, this is just saying in another way what you just said, Charles, but Ginsberg suddenly takes over the I went to the Garden of Love, and suddenly love becomes something much more interesting to me than perhaps it did when I first read the Blake. It's not simply a rant against the church. It's a celebration of all the alternatives, the more anarchic, physical, bodily, green alternatives.
Well, binding with briars, my joys and desires.
So that
sounds kind of erotic
itself.
Their
good stuff comes in through the back door.
I mean, I think that sounds better than whatever the Garden
of Love was. Now that's Charles on Allen on William, and that's taking us far afield.
Although
not too far from Allen Ginsberg.
I actually think it makes sense. I mean, just to make that point in a different way, if we read Ginsberg version as an erotic retelling, it doesn't make sense that the past is an idyllic erotic space and the present is bound up in a bad way by institution. I'm guessing that in fact it's the other way. It has to be.
Ginsberg is sexualizing what might or might not be a poem, an anti-church poem that has sexuality in it. Fair enough?
Yeah, right.
Which part is grudging?
I mean, I don't want to either disagree or agree because it forces the poem into too many upright positions. But I mean, for him, there's this sense of the strength and validity of joy and pleasure and play. But then, and there's of course the Garden of Love, maps onto the Garden of Eden, in terms of your hearing of it. But something has happened, and the point is he's never seen it before. It might have always been there. So suddenly there's consciousness, guilt, law, rule, and forbidden things. The mechanism is religion. So the recognition that death is in the world leads illogically to the binding of desires.
Priests in black gowns were walking their rounds and binding with briars my joys and desires.
I think for Blake, it's partly a dynamic and experience of, as Rachel is saying, experience is partly skepticism and a withdrawal from the world. It's a natural dialectic that you move away from a connection, and that it's not necessarily entirely imposed by social evil. It's something that happens to you that you have to use poetry to reimagine what innocence might be.
Now, if the question is thou shalt, for Blake, thou shalt not what? I love the way that it's just thou shalt not, which is a wonderful
over the door.
Right. So thou shalt not what for Blake? What would you say, Jessica?
I think there is it's thou shalt not just as a general edict. It's just a problem of institution. It tells you.
So it's simply a superego negative of the church.
Yes.
What about for Ginsberg? Thou shalt not, what does he mean? Thou shalt not make life a downer? more
some
than
of
that,
the
right?
Decalogue is actually kind of useful. I mean, it's there's
Well, I think it's joy and desire. Thou shalt not have joy and desire. That it's the moral code, which is, for Blake and for Ginsberg, a way of blocking your access to that imagination that's within all of us, that doesn't make us children again, but makes us able to participate ethically as citizens in the world.
Is the more natural and more anarchic life that is the result, that could be the alternative, that has to be stated negatively because it's a song of experience. If it were a song of innocence, we couldn't be offering as an alternative natural anarchic life because we don't have, because it's innocent, because we don't have the alternative.
A chapel was built in the midst where I used to play on the green, and the gates of this chapel were shut, and thou shalt not rid over the door.
What are some of the reasons why a poet today, and by today I mean Ginsberg's time as well, what are some of the reasons why a poet today would sing, literally sing, set a poem to music? And I mean to ask the three of you as poets, what's the urge? Why do you want to sing?
I see it as something disruptive. It disrupts the sort of the decorum of a poetry reading as we expect it to happen. And I think Leanne Brown is a great example of this. Poetry becomes something that's not on the page, and it's not just read. There's something else that happens in a reading space. And so it's enacted bodily.
Rachel, what are some of the reasons why?
Because you hear the sounds in your head. It's as if you'd start to break into song when you're writing. So why not carry that into the reading of the work?
Charles, what do you think?
You can go back to Campion, who'd be a good example, the best in the Renaissance, of somebody who made songs, but that the songs didn't have a separate melody, so that there's some kind of music in the words that comes out. And of course, since Blake calls these songs, it almost is a call to imagine what they would be. But the fact that they don't work as songs independently, and the fact that, in fact, this set of recordings of Ginsberg remains very obscure within his own work, it's one of the things that interests me about it. It brings song back to the level of the spoken voice rather than taking it away into the level of music.
I went to the garden of love and saw what I never had seen. A chapel was built in the midst where I used to play on the green.
We listen to singing quite differently. We listen to the quality of a voice suddenly in a way that sometimes poetry, at least when I'm sitting in a reading, I can tune out very easily. It's much more difficult to tune out from a song. Maybe I'm embarrassed to admit this, but poetry readings can, with a very lilting voice, just tend to go at one level that then can't be heard, but singing varies it.
Charles, when you put together Close Listening, a collection of essays about the sound of poetry and recorded poetry, did you think at all about this album that you love so much as being relevant?
Oh, sure, because that's about poets performing their work. And I think that as an upper limit, Zukowski has this famous integral, he calls it, upper limit music, lower limit speech. And song might be another poet obsessed with the concept of song. Song might be understood as the upper limit. There aren't hard and fast distinctions. One of the most common questions I get teaching undergraduate 20th century poetry is, why don't we have the song lyrics of, any number of Bob Dylan or Jim Morrison included. And of course, some of in fact, those three, Leonard Cohen as well, are poets who've written poems. The distinction I would make is simple, that a poem is something that is not meant to have a musical accompaniment with it. The sound and the tune it makes comes from the alphabetic material themselves. And, with librettos in the opera, it becomes another issue in that way. So the question is, within the performance of the verbal materials primarily, there are many different kinds of sounds that you can make. And I am interested in song as being a kind of shtick aspect, which is actually related to Ginsberg.
I get it.
A vaudeville kind of aspect, which nonetheless falls within the performance of poetry.
So what, in a word or a phrase, is Ginsberg doing to Blake?
He's interpreting it.
How?
He's adding the supplement of song and his presence to some degree, including the presence of the other musicians. He's making, in a certain sense, a substitute for a religious experience by interpreting religion and power and constructing a kind of resistance. So it's a resistant, religiously inflected experience. That's why I said it was like a new hymn, this particular one.
He's amping up what is already the political content of the poem, the anti-institutional content of the poem, which was, as critics have said, is directed specifically at the church as an institution. Ginsberg seems to be extending that by the singing of it. I mean, I would say that. I don't know how you feel.
I would add to interpreting and extending, he might actually be challenging also if part of the point of songs of experience, if part of the point is that people cannot connect or it's difficult to relate or their problems in relating, if song itself helps correct that problem, it's a challenge to that poem.
I remember hearing Ginsberg perform this in the 60s or early 70s and repeating a couplet from another one of the experience poems. Your youth and your day are wasted in play, and your winter and night in disguise. Your youth and your day are wasted in play. He did that for quite a long time, as if he was doing Om. It makes it into a drone or a chant. Repeated over and over, it makes into a kind of cosmic reality this interplay between the repetition is what's interesting. Well, that's why the problem. If you just hear one song, the album and the structure of the Blake 2 is based on repetition, constant repetition. So people who know Blake know it by heart because all of the lines are constantly repeating all the time in any of the. How sweet is the shepherd's sweet lot. From the morning to eve he roams. How sweet is the shepherd. How sweet is the shepherd's sweet lot. How sweet is the shepherd's sweet lot. How sweet.
I'm hearing an influence on you here.
Oh, there's no doubt about that.
Your poetry and poetics, Charles.
Right.
I'm hearing
from Blake.
Yeah,
from
no doubt
this,
about
and by Ginsberg.
Yeah. Pardon me, because I'm doing something to Bernstein that I probably shouldn't do, but getting it slightly to a mythic level by sacralizing the line, by repeating it and doing different emphases on it.
Mm-hmm. And off-tune, off-key.
And very much
off-key is crucial. To me, off-key is
really
crucial.
Have
and repetition.
I got my sense of off-key from listening to Dylan do his bridges. His bridges are all off-key because he sends himself up too high in the register and he can't do it.
It's not
so
entirely
that the bridge on
Bob
Just
Dylan.
Like a Woman is so hard to listen to, but so utterly fantastic because he's going to a place music's not supposed to go, certainly not music played on the radio. And I do think that there's a little bit of that in this Ginsberg where he takes a leap from the droning chanting songs to this country western plucky guitar waltz ballad thing, to the point where, it's fun, but it's still off-key and it's still not ready for prime time.
Oh, yeah, it's still hard to listen to on the couch. I mean, it's not what you play for fun unless you're Charles. Somehow.
And that'll have to be the final word on this. Before we get to the Gathering Paradise segment of our show, let me ask each of you to offer a final word on this poem, or maybe something more about what you get from it.
Well, here's the opening again, which is crucial to understanding the question that you are asking. Hear the voice of the bard, who present, past, and future sees. I think Ginsberg feels himself to be in a line of prophetic poets, and he is hearing the voice of the bard. And hearing the voice of the bard, he has to put that into song because they're called song. And I think that actually is not an ironic gesture on his part at all, but a gesture of invocation. I also don't think that Ginsberg is more political than Blake. I don't think you could actually be more political than Blake. In many ways, I think I wouldn't want to compare it, but I think Blake, the radicalness of Blake's politics is extraordinary.
Point taken. Jessica, final word?
I want to say I wish I had this album to play in college or a similar album. I don't know what it would have been for me. It doesn't exist.
Charles, a word. I'm sorry, I'm breaking the final word, but a word on what it was like at Harvard what is it that was so exciting about this?
I think that hearing Ginsberg, especially in the 68, 69, 70, was very thrilling because he was a voice against the Vietnam War, and he found a public voice. And I think, going back also to what Jessica said, I think this album allowed something to be prophetic, ironic, and public at the same time.
Rachel?
Yeah, to cure society, one has to get at the deep place where ideology is stored and reproduced. And when Ginsberg does this to Blake, interprets Blake and presents it further, he starts doing that for me.
Thank you. We like to end Poem Talk with a minute or two of Gathering Paradise, a chance for several of us to spread wide our narrow hands to gather a little something really poetically good to hail, puff up, commend someone or something going on in the poetry world. Rachel, can you gather a little paradise for us?
Well, the paradise that's so clear from this session of Poem Talk is Blake as a sensual experience. So I would like to point to the Blake Archive, www.blakearchive.org, which has the manuscripts that Blake produced as illustrations, but more than illustrations, as embodiments of the poems, which are individualized, handmade, and tracing out his attitude as it changed to his own poems. It's a wonderful resource.
Thank you. Charles?
Often I am permitted to return to a meadow that is a made place. I think of that line of Robert Duncan on Penn Sound to be reminded of the whole archive of Penn Sound itself as a kind of sound dimension that is accessible in an extraordinary way now. And our new Penn Sound Daily, which is being curated and edited by Mike Hennessy, our new managing director at Penn Sound. You can go just to the Penn Sound homepage and you can get a XML feed of the new and the old at Penn Sound on a daily basis. Your dose of paradise.
Well, that's all the binding briars we have time for on Poem Talk today. Poem Talk at the Writers' House is a collaboration of the Center for Programs in Contemporary Writing and the Kelly Writers' House at the University of Pennsylvania and the Poetry Foundation of Chicago, poetryfoundation.org. Thanks to my guests Charles Bernstein, Jessica Lowenthal, and Rachel Blau DuPlessis, and to my co-producer Mark Lindsay, and Poem Talk's amazing director and editor Steve McLaughlin, with special help from Curtis Fox. This is Al Filreis, and I hope you'll join us again soon for another Poem Talk.
Chapel was built in the mist, where I used to play on the green, and the gates of this chapel were shut, and thou shalt not rid over the door.
So I turned to
The garden of love.
That's
So many sweet flowers bore.
And I
saw it was filled with graves, and tombstones where flowers should be. And priests in black gowns were walking their rounds, binding with briars my joys and desires. Well done.